The story of a life well lived doesn't always have a clear ending. A surprising number of people who achieved fame quite simply vanished at some point, never to appear in public again. We still don't know what happened to these notable folks. You know, you can occasionally mistake a stranger for someone you know. Lord Lucan has your most embarrassing mix-up beat, because his mistake actually turned deadly. In 1974, the British nobleman tried to bludgeon his wife Victoria to death in her London home after she divorced him and won custody of their kids. Except Lucan didn't actually kill his wife. His wife was in a different darkened room. Lucan had just killed Sandra Rivet, his children's beloved nanny. The case was a media sensation in Britain thanks to Lucan's fame as an aristocrat and notorious reputation as a gambling cad. After the night of November 7, 1974, though, he became even more famous for disappearing. After murdering Rivet, Lucan vanished. As you can probably guess, he was never found. He was finally declared dead in 1999, but his son wasn't allowed to inherit his title until 2016, according to the BBC. There are, of course, many theories about what happened to Lucan. Some people think he drowned himself in New Haven Harbor, while others think he went into hiding in Africa and died around the turn of the millennium. There's even a theory that his rich friends pushed him to kill himself, then fed his body to tigers at one of their private zoos. Sandra Rivet's son, Neil Berriman, claims that Lucan is still alive and living as a Buddhist in Australia, but sadly, none of this has ever been confirmed. Hart Crane was a modernist poet in the mold of T.S. Eliot, and he eventually became a leading writer in the American poetry scene in the early 20th century. Sadly, despite his early career success, by 1932, Crane was gone without a trace. Crane's father, Clarence Arthur Crane, was a wealthy Ohio candy maker who had a difficult relationship with his poet's son. In April 1932, after the elder Crane died, the poet reportedly grew depressed, according to friends who spoke to the New York Times. After winning a prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship and relocating to Mexico to write an epic poem, Crane boarded an ocean liner headed back to New York. Along the way, he either jumped or fell into the Atlantic Ocean. The 32-year-old poet's body was never found, and he didn't leave a note to explain what had happened. After serving in the Royal Navy, Ian MacKintosh turned the adventure, intrigue, and thrills of his military career into art and entertainment. He published a series of action novels in the 1960s and 1970s, then made the leap to television. In the UK, he's best known for military dramas like Warship and the spy series The Sandbaggers. After a successful TV career, though, MacKintosh disappeared in what could have been a plot in one of his own spy adventures. On July 7, 1979, MacKintosh was traveling in Alaska, flying a single-engine plane with his partner Susan and his friend Graham Barber. Shortly before 6 p.m., Barber sent a distress signal from the plane, and an air traffic controller called the Coast Guard for help. Sadly, the Coast Guard never found a trace of the plane, despite searching for days. MacKintosh, his partner, and his pilot simply vanished. Patrick McDermott was a cameraman who is best known for his 9-year relationship with Grease star and pop singer Olivia Newton-John, and it was that relationship that led to widespread public interest when he vanished in 2005. According to The Telegraph, McDermott was on board a chartered fishing boat called the Freedom of California in June 2005, but didn't make it back with the ship. Philip Klein, a private investigator hired by Dateline to find the 48-year-old cameraman, theorized in 2009 that McDermott faked his death and vanished so he could cancel out substantial debts and allow his son to cash in on a $150,000 life insurance policy. Klein firmly believed that McDermott was alive, citing 17 credible reported sightings, many of them from Cabo San Lucas, Mexico, the last place McDermott was seen alive. According to the CBC, another investigation ruled that McDermott had likely drowned in the Pacific Ocean. However, in November 2017, the Australian tabloid New Idea published pictures of someone they claimed was McDermott, alive and well in Mexico. Eventually, though, another man came forward to claim he was the guy in the photos. So what happened to McDermott is still a mystery. As for Newton-John, she simply had to make peace with not knowing what happened.
Those are the things in life you have to accept and let go.
Roald Amundsen was a legendary explorer famous for leading the first expedition to ever reach the South Pole way back in 1911. He was an experienced adventurer, well-versed in harsh climates, but even he disappeared without a trace during an attempted rescue of another expedition in 1928. Amundsen was on board a seaplane sent by the French Air Force in 1928 to rescue the survivors of a plane crash in the Arctic Circle. Unfortunately, the plane disappeared on its way to take part in the rescue mission. A final radio message came through 19 nautical miles from Bear Island at about 6:45 p.m. on June 18th, and then it was never seen again. Amundsen, along with everyone else on board, was lost forever. He was 55 years old. Imagine if Lord Byron, Sid Vicious, and a moody teenager all managed to magically meld together and create a single person. That person would look and act a whole lot like Manic Street Preacher's rhythm guitarist and lyricist Richey Edwards, a mid-1990s British rock idol whom The Guardian called a lightning rod of sorts for adolescent angst. Edwards was handsome, moody, and dreamy, with a talent for writing lyrics about depression, and an even bigger talent for disturbing publicity stunts. When a journalist with music magazine NME implied his band's posturing was insincere, Edwards grabbed a razor blade and carved "for real" in his own arm. It's not surprising then that when he first went missing in February 1995, it could have just been interpreted as another chapter in his twin stories of self-destruction and self-promotion. However, it quickly became apparent that the young poet was gone for good. Edwards had been due to fly to the US with MSP frontman James Dean Bradfield when he disappeared from his hotel room. His car was later found abandoned near the Severn Bridge, which connects England and Wales. Edwards was legally declared dead in 2008, but no body has ever surfaced. Still, sightings of the musician have reached halfway across the world and all the way to Goa, India. And published in 2019, Withdrawn Traces, Searching for the Truth About Richie Manic, alleges that Edwards faked his own disappearance. Did he? It's looking more and more unlikely that we'll ever know. Here's some advice for any disappointed artists out there. Just because no one likes your stuff now doesn't mean people won't one day be discussing how underrated you are. Just look at Connie Converse. A 1950s musician, she's now considered the first modern singer-songwriter crooning intimate, lyrical ballads suffused with melancholy, long before anyone was talking about Bob Dylan. Not that her contemporaries were aware how groundbreaking Converse was. In 1961, she quit music altogether, unknown and convinced she was a failure. In a happier universe, Converse's tale would now take a redemptive turn. In 2009, a handful of songs she'd recorded in the kitchen of illustrator and audio engineer Gene Deitch were released by Deitch's record label. The album, How Sad, How Lovely, became a cult hit. The New Yorker profiled her. People realized she'd been amazing. Sadly, Converse saw none of this success because she disappeared in 1974. 74 was a bad year for Converse. She just turned 50 and she felt like a failure. That summer, she wrote to her friends that she was going to make a fresh start, loaded up her car, and drove off into legend. No trace of her has ever surfaced, and there's a chance she's out there, way into her old age, maybe even aware that her talent has finally been discovered. If Jim Sullivan's name isn't ringing any bells, that's because he's the definition of a cult artist. A folk rocker who was part of the LA scene in the 60s and early 70s, Sullivan cut just 2 records before heading to Nashville for what was meant to be his big break. He never made it. His car was found abandoned in the desert outside Santa Rosa, New Mexico. His wallet, clothes, and guitar were all found in a nearby motel. Of Sullivan himself, there was no trace. As record company Light in the Attic explained in its notes for the re-release of Sullivan's UFO album, he was a guy who should have been famous. Phil Spector's Wrecking Crew backed him on his first record. He had a small part in Easy Rider. Oh, and he was an excellent writer of depressed melancholy pop. Had he reached Nashville, he might be up there with the greats. But Sullivan never made it to Tennessee. As one of his friends said, Sullivan would have never left his guitar behind if he planned to vanish. Appropriately for a dude who released a record called UFO, which featured lyrics about driving into the desert and being abducted by aliens, one of the more prominent theories is that he was, you guessed it, abducted by aliens.
And like it was just going right across the sky, man, and then... it just suddenly, it just changed direction and went whizzing right off.
Barbara Newhall Follett was a jazz-age writing prodigy. She published her first novel around age 13, something that's hard enough to do even when your novel is a self-published fan fiction. When that novel is The House Without Windows, a complex work that wins rave reviews in the New York Times, publishing it as a teenager is basically a miracle. Everyone who read the book agreed Follett was going to be the next great American writer. Follett did indeed vanish, but we're not quite to that part of the story yet, and that's not the reason you've never read any of her books. After putting out just 2 novels, Follett was forced to give up her writing when her father suddenly took off with a younger woman, leaving Follett and her mother penniless. By age 16, Follett was working as a typist and fending for herself. Then, in 1939, the then 26-year-old Follett had an argument with her husband and left the house. She never returned, and no trace of her was ever found. According to literary magazine Lampin's Quarterly, her husband barely bothered to look for her, and the press wasn't alerted until 1966. By then, her disappearance was well into cold case territory. If you know Rico Harris, you probably know him for disappearing. The gentle giant vanished one night in 2014 somewhere along State Route 16 near Sacramento. The resulting manhunt gripped the press, but it only gripped them because Harris used to be somebody. In 2000, Harris played basketball for the Harlem Globetrotters, a team so famous that even people who know nothing about sports recognize the name. Before that, he'd been a top 100 college basketball recruit. but substance abuse and injury kept him from reaching his full potential, and he wound up out of basketball and working as a security guard in LA. The final blow came in 2014 when he was fired for drunkenness. He left his mom's LA house to drive to Seattle and stay with his girlfriend. His car was later found abandoned outside Sacramento. A 2017 profile in the LA Times recounts the strange details. Harris, who had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, was known for disappearing for days on end and not taking his medication. This time, he was described as out of sorts. A backpack and phone that had taken a video of him were found on the roadside, but when police searched the wilderness using a heat vision camera, they found nothing. Human footprints were found in sand, and reports of a man walking down the highway trickled in, but Harris was never found. The LA Times suggests he was probably picked up as a hitchhiker. After that, who knows? Canadian band Loverboy was one of the biggest rock bands of the early 80s, with hard-charging hits like Hot Girls in Love and Working for the Weekend, which is still played on just about every radio station in the world every Friday afternoon. Scott Smith was a founding member, staying with the group all the way until his mysterious and frightening disappearance at sea on November 30th, 2000. After playing with his band in Vancouver, BC, at a benefit for the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, Smith, two friends, and his girlfriend set out for Mexico on a 37-foot sailboat. As they sailed down the coast and neared San Francisco, the weather got rough, with the seas throwing up gigantic waves. One of them, estimated to be about 20 feet high, knocked Smith off the deck of the vessel and into the water. Coast Guard helicopters arrived within 20 minutes and dispatched two search boats, which scoured a 133 square mile area to no avail. When fog and continuing high waves ended that search, Smith's family paid for a private search by a San Francisco company, and that too proved fruitless. Smith's remains have never surfaced. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry is the guy who wrote The Little Prince, a children's book of such beauty, such power, and such simplicity that it's tempting to say no life can be declared complete until one has read it at least once. He was also a fanatical aviator and a death-defying acrobat of the skies who once crash-landed in the Libyan desert and spent a week wandering, lost and on the brink of death, before being miraculously found by a passing Bedouin. When World War II kicked off, Saint-Exupéry was desperate to do his bit for his native France. After the US entered the war, he volunteered his skills as a pilot. Unfortunately, aircraft tech had kinda moved on since his heyday, to the extent that the great writer was more hindrance than help. His second ever mission for the Allies, he managed to crash into an olive grove. On his sixth, he wound up landing on Corsica instead of Sardinia, a mistake that left him stranded for several days. It didn't help that he got drunk before some missions. In short, he was a liability. All of which may explain what happened on his 10th mission. On July 31st, 1944, Saint-Exupéry took off on a mission over the Mediterranean. He was never seen again. Although wreckage from his plane was recovered in 2000, no body has ever been identified. It's possible he survived the wreck, but it's probably more likely that he drowned.
To me, you will be unique in all the world. What is essential is invisible to the eye.
Theodosia Burr Alston might not be a household name these days, but let's put it this way. Imagine the chaos if Ivanka Trump one day just vanished. America got a taste of that back in 1813 when Alston, the daughter of former Vice President Aaron Burr, stepped onto a small boat docked in Georgetown, South Carolina, and was never seen again. At the time, Alston, who was married to a wealthy South Carolina plantation owner, was as infamous as her father. Burr's duel with Alexander Hamilton had been brought on in part by rumors that the VP and his daughter were engaging in some hot and heavy incestuous loving. Then, when Burr headed out west to establish his own breakaway nation, it was Alston who bankrolled his megalomania. When he was tried for treason, she was there, and when he fled the country, it was with her help. All of this came at a cost. Alston was known to be desperately unhappy and suffering from chronic ill health after the birth of her child. After her father left the country and her son died, she slipped into an inescapable funk. When she vanished, it didn't take long for the public to put two and two together and make approximately 5 billion conspiracy theories. The truth is probably more mundane than any of them, including the one that suggests she ran off to be a pirate. Alston was sailing through fierce storms on a trip up the coast from South Carolina to New York, and the schooner never arrived, making it likely that the ship went down in the storm. In the 2 decades before rock and roll took hold, big bands ruled the music world, and there were few as successful and well-known as the operation run by Glenn Miller. After working as an arranger and trombone player, Miller formed his own band and scored one jazzy, brassy, era-defining hit after another, racking up 17 top 10 hits in 1939 and 31 in 1940. World War II interrupted Miller's career. He joined the Air Force as an officer but still played war bond rallies and for his fellow military men. In 1944, the 40-year-old Miller took his act and his band to the UK, and on December 15th, he boarded a plane bound for Paris, where he was set to perform for troops. The small aircraft went up over the English Channel and was never seen again. According to Colorado Public Radio, conditions were bad that day, and it's possible that Miller's plane crashed into the English Channel after a malfunction caused by a frozen fuel intake line. While not a celebrity in the traditional sense, Jimmy Hoffa was incredibly famous as the president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, one of the country's largest and most powerful labor unions. That made him well known. The crimes for which he was convicted made him notorious, as did alleged connections with the world of organized crime. After a 1965 conviction by a federal jury for taking funds from a trucking company and trying to funnel a bribe to a juror's son, Hoffa stepped down as Teamsters president, but he still held sway in the organization. On July 30th, 1975, 61-year-old Hoffa called his wife from a suburban Detroit restaurant to tell her that his lunch appointment with two known organized criminals was off because the guys had failed to show up. That's the last time anybody heard anything from Hoffa. Where did he go? There's the disproven urban legend that mobsters killed him and then buried him in Giant Stadium in New Jersey. And there's also a theory presented to a grand jury that Hoffa was the victim of a professional hit because he planned to reveal that the mob had taken control of the Teamsters and was funneling pension money into various criminal activities. At this point, it's likely we may never know the truth. The Incredible String Band was possibly the most countercultural late 60s band in existence, combining the folky, hippie musical stylings popular in the era with psychedelic rock, which also resonated with young people at the time. Founded by Robin Williamson and Mike Herron, they added their respective girlfriends Christina Licorice McKechnie and Rose Simpson to the group and enjoyed some modest success on the lower runs of the Billboard album chart. That was thanks in part to the vocal and songwriting contributions of McKechnie, who bopped around on the fringes of the folk music scene in the 1970s. A native of Edinburgh, Scotland, McKechnie returned to the area in 1986 to visit relatives, and not long after, her whereabouts veered into the unknown. Her sister later suggested that McKechnie was in Sacramento recovering from surgery in 1990, while others had reported that McKechnie's last known sighting came when she was seen hitchhiking in the Arizona desert in 1987. Ylenia Carrisi was essentially already famous at the moment she was born in 1970. Her father, Albano Carrisi, a popular Italian singer in the 1960s. In 1970, Albano married American singer-songwriter Romina Power, the daughter of mid-century movie superstar Tyrone Power, and they became a highly successful double act in Europe, as well as the parents of two kids, including Ylenia. The younger Carrisi made her entertainment debut in the 1984 Italian film Champagne in Paradiso before appearing in 1989 as a letter-turner on Italian's version of Wheel of Fortune. 5 years after that, the 23-year-old Carrisi disappeared. Taking a sabbatical from the University of London to research a novel, Carrisi visited Florida and the French Quarter of New Orleans. She left her passport and luggage behind and never returned, and although she was declared dead in 2014, there's been speculation that her disappearance was purposeful. Vancouver-based musician Forrest Schab was a rapper who performed under the stage name DY, an ominous abbreviation of his nickname Die Young. He broke out big in 2009 and 2010, signed a deal with CP Records, released the hit club track Passenger, and toured Canada as an opening act for Akon. He was preparing to drop his second single, That's My Spot, and his first full-length album when, in August 2010, the 26-year-old rapper apparently flew from Toronto to Mexico. A few weeks later, he wished a friend happy birthday on his social media accounts, and that marked the last time Schab would make contact with anyone. Schab's family contacted the Toronto Police Service, whose search as to the rapper's whereabouts didn't turn up any viable leads. He remains missing today. A rising pop star in his native Chechnya and other North Caucasian states, Zelim Bakaev performed in Chechen and Russian and recorded popular songs like Nana and Without You. Then, in 2017, he was set to compete on the Russian version of Star Academy, a reality show hybrid of American Idol and Big Brother. Until that is, 25-year-old Bakaev traveled to the Chechen capital city of Grozny on August 8, 2017. Local LGBT community advocates allege that within hours of arriving in his hometown, Bakaev was arrested and was sent to a government facility where he was tortured and killed, a victim of the country's efforts to eradicate gay people in Chechnya. Chechen President Ramzan Kadyrov publicly denied that his government had anything to do with Bakaev's disappearance or possible death, suggesting instead that the singer's own relatives killed him because of his sexuality. Kadyrov said his family couldn't stop him and then called him back home, and his brothers, it seems, accused him. Isn't there anyone in the village, any man in the family who can admit, we did this? They know full well who it was. The singer's father, Zelim Bakaev, denied that this was the case and told Radio Free Europe none of his relatives laid a finger on him. There was no reason to lay a finger on him. Forward guard John Brisker moved up to the NBA in 1972 when he signed with the Seattle Supersonics. His numbers in the Moore Premier League weren't quite up to snuff with what was expected though, and he was cut from the Sonics in 1975. According to the Seattle Times, he went to Africa in 1978 to start up an import-export venture. On April 11, 1978, Brisker called his girlfriend from Uganda. Brisker was not seen or heard from again. It's possible he met his end in the violent coup that rocked Uganda that year. His former teammates entertained rumors that he was slaughtered and eaten by dictator Idi Amin, or that he angered the leader who then shot him. The U.S. State Department could not actually confirm if Brisker had ever traveled to Africa in the first place, but at any rate, in May 1985, the King County Medical Examiner in Seattle declared Brisker dead so that his estate could be settled. In 1939, the NCAA held its first ever men's college basketball tournament. The University of Oregon took home the win, and the champion players became minor celebrities, particularly towering star center Ergel Slim Wintermute. According to the Boston Globe, the All-American from Portland could dunk the ball, a novelty at the time. After college, Wintermute worked for airplane manufacturer Boeing in Seattle, married and fathered 3 children. In October 1977, the 60-year-old Wintermute took a boat out of Seattle-adjacent Lake Washington with a friend. Sometime after his companion went to sleep on the large boat, he left the craft and was never seen or heard from again. The athlete's son told police that his father was on medication for a heart issue and that he might have had a heart attack and fallen into the water. His remains were never recovered. In the 1930s, Amelia Earhart was an American hero and one of the most famous people on the planet, and with good reason. Earhart did amazing things with airplanes when aviation was still in its infancy, when the idea of humans flying via mechanical means was all a delightful and inspiring novelty. In 1932, the National Women's History Museum says Earhart became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, unaccompanied, and she was awarded the Cross of the French Legion of Honor and the American Distinguished Flying Cross, among other achievements. In 1937, Earhart set out on a journey that would prove ambitious and mysterious. She aimed to be the first woman to fly all the way around the globe. Alongside her navigator, Fred Noonan, Earhart departed Miami on June 1st. By July 2nd, they'd made it to New Guinea with plans to hit Howland Island, a small uninhabited landmass between Hawaii and Australia. Sometime en route, Earhart, dealing with poor weather and low fuel, lost contact with the Coast Guard liaison. Her plane never landed, and it was never discovered. Nor were Earhart or Noonan, despite a joint Coast Guard and Navy search effort that encompassed 250,000 square miles. Her disappearance remains one of the most enduring mysteries of American history.
In case you weren't listening, I'm not one to shy away from danger.
How about Spears? You want to shy away from Spears?
In the late 90s and early 2000s, child and teen actor Joe Pichler appeared in a series of small and supporting roles in a number of movies and TV shows, including Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, Touched by an Angel, Varsity Blues, and most notably in 2 direct-to-video sequels in the Beethoven family film franchise. And then he disappeared. According to the Charlie Project, Pichler spoke with a friend at about 4 a.m. on January 5, 2006 in his northeastern Washington hometown of Bremerton. It was a few weeks before his 19th birthday when he left his apartment untouched, unlocked, and with the lights on. He took only his wallet and car keys before he disappeared without telling anyone where he might be going. He left no clues behind aside from some poems that spoke to his depressed state. 4 days later, Pichler's Toyota Corolla was located in Bremerton, and authorities suspected that Pichler may have jumped to his death off of a bridge over Port Madison Narrows, but no evidence of that nor his remains were ever recovered. If you were alive in 1910, Dorothy Arnold's name would have been extremely familiar. The disappearance of the 25-year-old socialite was the news story of the year, mixing wealth, scandal, and mystery into a single hyperactive news cocktail. A prominent celeb in New York City, Arnold vanished in the middle of Central Park in broad daylight. The subsequent case saw her star profile go supernova. The details of the case read like the pitch for hard-boiled detective drama. Things weren't going smoothly at home. Arnold had fallen out with her millionaire father, who refused to let her move out of the house. She kept a secret post office box no one knew about, possibly connected to her writing career. She was having a fling with a man 20 years her senior, George Griscom Jr., and had recently pawned her jewelry after meeting him. Then she went shopping one day and never returned. Arnold's rich dad was so worried about the bad publicity his disappearing daughter might bring that he didn't tell the police for months. He had hired his own gumshoes to investigate, and they turned up squat. There were rumors Arnold had been murdered by Griscom, rumors she'd committed suicide, and rumors she died in a botched backstreet abortion. Over a century later, no one is the wiser. At the time he went missing, Hale Boggs was one of the most famous politicians in America. A Democrat from New Orleans, Boggs had sat on the Warren Commission investigating JFK's assassination before becoming House Majority Leader during the Nixon years. Even though he looks black and white here, he had a personality that you could call colorful. He verbally attacked J. Edgar Hoover in Congress. He was thought to be an alcoholic, and he became famous for doubting the lone gunman theory of the JFK shooting. So yeah, Hale Boggs, kind of a big deal in 1972. Hence the nationwide shock when he disappeared. On October 16th that year, Boggs was in Alaska helping a fellow congressman's re-election bid. The two got on a light aircraft heading for remote Juneau. According to Medium, they were never seen again. The weather was terrible that day. As soon as Boggs failed to show in Juneau, everyone guessed what had probably happened. What was then the biggest search operation in U.S. history was launched, with 90 planes searching 325,000 square miles of Alaska, but no trace of the missing aircraft or its occupants was ever found. To this day, there are some out there who think Boggs was killed for his work investigating the JFK assassination. It's not like there could be any other explanation for a small airplane vanishing over water in bad weather, right?
Man, it's a mystery! It's a mystery wrapped in a riddle inside an enigma!
Were he anybody else, Michael Rockefeller's disappearance in 1961 would not have been big news. But he wasn't anybody else. He was Michael freaking Rockefeller, son of the famous Nelson Rockefeller. It may have only been because of his name, but when Michael Rockefeller vanished off the coast of what was then Netherlands, New Guinea, the world sat up and paid attention. The whole story is more strange and twisted than you can imagine. After a privileged upbringing, Michael decided to take a trip way out into the Pacific to both collect primitive art and maybe find himself. He wound up boating around New Guinea, the island today split between Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, and even made some friends among the local tribes. At least he thought he did. On November 19, 1961, Michael's boat overturned near the Asmat region of the island. The boys swam to shore to look for help, and that's it. Nobody ever saw him again. While it's widely assumed he drowned, at least some members of local tribes have told stories indicating he was killed on reaching shore. If you don't know the name Daniel Lynn Lagerlof, that's because you didn't spend the formative years of your life living in the land of gritty Swedish noir fiction. A writer and director, Lagerlof was the mind behind multiple Swedish classics. In 2011, Lagerlof was scouting locations for an upcoming thriller project in southern Sweden, inside a nature reserve known as Sherpanen. A wild and remote island just off the mainland, Sherpanen is bleak, windswept, and not the sort of place you'd expect to easily get lost, all of which is why Lagerlof's fate is so puzzling. According to Sweden's news website Local, Lagerlof split off from his friends to investigate the island alone. He was never seen again. Sherpanen is surrounded by water, so it's entirely possible the director slipped and fell in and simply vanished beneath the waves. He's presumed dead, but no body has been found, and no one can say for certain what happened. Officially, he remains missing. In a certain place at a certain point in time, Zahir Raihan's name was known to millions. He shot to international fame in 1971 with his 20-minute documentary Stop Genocide. Depicting the plight of Bangladeshi refugees fleeing the country's liberation war with Pakistan, it shone a spotlight on those suffering under a military regime that may have killed up to 3 million people. It also shone a spotlight on Raihan himself. In January 1972, barely a month after the war had ended with Bangladesh declaring independence, Raihan went missing. It's thought he was abducted by Pakistani security forces. After that, well, you can probably guess. The tragic part is that Raihan was only in a position to be kidnapped because he was looking for his missing brother. The Dhaka Tribune claims Raihan's brother was abducted off the streets of Bangladesh 2 days before the end of the war. When the dust of the conflict had settled, Raihan went looking for him, only to vanish himself. In another universe, Weldon Kees is one of those names you got sick of studying in American Lit class.
What the
A poet who tried to bridge the divide between Jazz Age experimentation and New Age madness, Kees was someone who was always on the verge of making it big. Living in New York, he attended literary parties alongside people like the novelist Graham Greene. But Kees never became famous exactly. The sad part was he disappeared too soon for that. Kees spent decades failing to break into the literary scene, and by 1955 he was gloomily talking about vanishing off to Mexico and never returning. In July of that year, he told his friend Janet Richards things are pretty bad and mentioned going away. After that, he up and vanished into legend. The next day, July 19, 1955, Kees's car was discovered by the Golden Gate Bridge. His wallet, sleeping bag, and account savings book went missing along with him. Who knows, maybe Kees managed to forge a new life down south away from all the pressures of literature.
Before he changed his name, Bison Dele was better known as basketball player Brian Williams, a 6'11" man mountain who left a trail of fire and bruised egos through the NBA. He was also famously eccentric. When he quit both basketball and the United States at the age of 30, he went on an endless nomadic voyage through Asia, living as a kind of wealthy hobo while writing beat poetry. On July 7, 2002, Dele set sail on his private boat from Tahiti to Hawaii with his girlfriend Serena Carlin, his brother Miles DeBoard, and ship captain Bertrand Saldo. Dele, Carlin, and Saldo were never seen again. 2 months later, DeBoard was arrested in Phoenix trying to buy gold with one of his brother's checks. Released on bail, he took his own life via insulin overdose just across the Mexican border. Authorities believe he slew the other 3 and dumped their bodies in the Pacific, but only the sea knows for sure. Legendary Chicano activist Oscar Zeta Acosta was a big man with even bigger appetites. Immortalized by Hunter S. Thompson as Dr. Gonzo in the classic novel Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Acosta was later portrayed by Benicio del Toro in the 1998 film adaptation. By then, however, Acosta had been missing for decades. In 1974, he visited his ancestral home in Mexico and simply vanished. Thompson spent years trying to find out what happened to his friend, eventually concluding that Acosta had been the victim of a drug hit or possibly even a political assassination. Others think he might have suffered a nervous breakdown and gone off the grid. The truth will likely never be known. It was one of the most shocking events in Australian history. On December 17, 1967, the nation's leader went out for a swim in the ocean and was never seen again. Prime Minister Harold Holt was 2 years into his term when he vanished into what friends called the highest surf they had ever seen. Holt was presumed drowned, but his body was never found, in part because there was no official government investigation. That's because laws at the time made it illegal to conduct an inquest without a body. That fueled numerous conspiracy theories, with his disappearance attributed to everything from a CIA assassination to shark attack. Finally, in 2005, an investigation officially concluded he had, in fact, drowned after all. Errol Flynn was one of the most famous movie stars who ever lived. His son, Sean Flynn, struggled to get out of his father's long shadow, and those efforts may have cost him his life. Sean appeared in 10 movies, but they were mostly bombs, and his acting career never fully took off. Hoping to prove he was his own man, Sean became a Time magazine war correspondent and flew to Vietnam.
Cameraman Sean Flynn, who filmed these scenes, later went on patrol outside the camp perimeter.
On April 6, 1970, he and fellow journalist Dana Stone decided to photograph a Viet Cong checkpoint. They were captured by communist guerrillas and never seen again. It's widely believed they were held captive for over a year before being executed by the Khmer Rouge in 1971, but no proof of Sean's final fate has ever been found. One of the most acclaimed authors in American history, the true story of Ambrose Bierce's disappearance really is stranger than fiction. In 1913, despite not speaking a word of Spanish, Bierce traveled to Mexico to report on the revolution and joined Pancho Villa's army as an observer. In December, he reportedly wrote a letter saying he was heading to an unknown destination. He couldn't have been more right. Nobody knows where he went or what happened to him, as he was never heard from again. Various theories suggest he was executed, or was shot during a battle, or even that he ended his own life and the rest was a cover story made up by his assistant. It's a mystery that will likely never be solved.
Sweet Jimmy Robinson was famous for exactly 94 seconds. On one fateful day in February 1961, he did something only 49 other men in the history of the world could claim to have done. He stepped into a ring with the greatest boxer of all time, Muhammad Ali. That the bout even happened was a fluke. Ali wasn't yet the giant he became, still going by his birth name Cassius Clay.
Weighing 192.5 pounds, Cassius Clay!
But his reputation had built up enough that the guy he'd originally been scheduled to fight that evening didn't show. In need of a new opponent, the manager at the Miami Beach venue basically begged Robinson to get into the ring. Robinson obliged, and barely a minute and a half later, he was on the mat, looking up at the lights. Robinson's career from that point on was not especially notable, to the point that nobody even realized he was missing until 2009, when an ESPN reporter teamed up with an autograph collector to find all of Ali's 50 opponents. Robinson was the only one they couldn't locate. The last known sighting of him was in 1979, when a photographer found him broke and living on veteran benefits. What happened to him after that, or if he's even still alive, is a mystery. In the days before CGI, when a movie or TV show needed to film a thrilling airplane sequence, they'd often call Art Scholl. The Los Angeles Times notes that Scholl was an airshow stunt pilot and aeronautics instructor in the San Bernardino Valley before Hollywood came calling. He flew in films for around a decade before he vanished on the set of arguably the biggest aviation movie ever, Top Gun. While performing a scripted upside-down spin maneuver, Scholl apparently lost control of his Pitts special plane at an altitude of about 4,000 feet. He radioed that there was a problem before his plane crashed into the Pacific Ocean 5 miles off the coast of Encinitas. After a day of searching, the rescue mission was called off and the Coast Guard ruled he likely did not survive the accident. Neither Scholl's remains nor his plane were ever found. Pierre Bianconi played for several high-level pro soccer teams in France throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s. He didn't score all that many goals, but he was famous, if not notorious, for his aggressive and unruly behavior, routinely racking up yellow and red penalty cards. During one such incident in 1985, he slapped an opposing player. He then took the red card out of the official's hands, ripped it up, and headbutted the referee, giving him a bloody nose and earning a 6-month ban from competitive soccer. According to L'Equipe, Bianconi was spotted in the port city of Bastia in December 1993 before he disappeared. His car was found, but the former soccer player never emerged, nor was heard from again. Jean Spangler didn't leave a lengthy or esteemed filmography. She appeared in just 8 films in the late 1940s, uncredited, always as an extra, dancer, or chorus girl. By the time she disappeared on October 7, 1949, the 27-year-old's movie career was just getting started. According to the Los Angeles Times, Spangler set out on foot to a farmer's market from her home in the Park La Brea neighborhood. She never arrived. Authorities and crime historians have bandied around a number of theories as to what happened to her. For one, Spangler reportedly had ties to organized criminal Mickey Cohen and ran afoul of his associates.
I mean, she dated everybody. And it wasn't just show business people, it was gangsters.
She'd also recently been engaged in a contentious custody battle for her daughter with her ex-husband, who threatened her on numerous occasions. 2 days after she vanished, a Griffith Park employee found Spangler's purse in a glen with a torn strap and a mysterious note inside that read, "Kirk, can't wait any longer. Going to see Dr. Scott. It will work best this way while Mother is away." That led to the theory that Spangler was pregnant and planned an abortion. Spangler was an extra and young man with a horn alongside star Kirk Douglas, who was questioned but cleared of any wrongdoing. The case remains unsolved.